This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about short stories. So, short form fiction, does that mean we have a short episode?
And we're done. No.
Yes. Yep. So, Kathryn, if you don't mind me sharing, you said time is limited, writing time is so precious. So you're trying to do some short form work right now. What's coming to mind? What challenges are you facing, or what questions do you have?
Man. You know, my biggest challenge is finding a conflict that is small enough, but not insignificant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I've been enjoying, like listening to the reading series, for example, like finding that plot line that is small enough that you can do it in that shorter form without my brain spinning it into this massive colossal thing.
Yes.
Because my brain is currently trained for long form, and I want so badly to just get back into writing, and short form is what the time is allowed right now, right? So I guess, how do we find that kind of happy ground of conflict?
Yeah, so I think one really helpful thing is to not label it as conflict. Because when we think conflict, we think climax, we think of stakes and tension and, arcs. So think in terms of concept, character, turning point, and of course, tension, but it can be very subtle tension. It doesn't have to be tension in the sense that we think of in novels with plot driving us through a story. Short stories, one of the beautiful things about them is that they can be more conceptual, more quiet, more like tableau-esque, kind of single moment. So they do have something at the end, like a hinge, that thing the whole story turns on, so that the reader finishes the story and you're like, okay, I got to sit with this. I've got to think about it. 3 hours later, cooking dinner, you're like, oh, wow. Right?
Right. And it's interesting to me, like, as you kind of explore short stories more and short fiction, is it is a very different animal.
Yes.
Right? It's not the same. You have a lot of the same elements. But like you said, like, there's that hinge, and short stories have a lot more of, like, letting the reader do a lot more of the work at the end there. I feel like,
yes.
Is it fair to say that short stories have that, the climax is almost more like at 97% often, rather than like more like middle of act 3 kind of? It feels like there's often more like 2 sentences to end the story, or a paragraph to end the story, rather than a scene, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I hate even using the word climax when I'm thinking about short stories, though.
Ending.
Yeah, I know we've talked about Bullet in the Brain on the show before, and people can find it online if you Google Bullet in the Brain PDF.
I'll link it in the show notes too, because I've found it.
Yeah, awesome. So come to storyworkspodcast.com show notes. Kathryn will have a link for you there. But when you think in terms of climax, the story is about this guy who's standing in line at a bank, and he's really grouchy and kind of a jerk to the other people in line. And then some robbers come in, gunmen holding up the bank, and this guy starts laughing, and they shoot him in the head, hence the title. Well, isn't that a climax? I mean, that's as big as dramatic action gets and as big as stakes are. This guy's dead, right? But what Wolf does is he slows down time. So that's really the beginning of the story, because we've got this very unlikable guy. Short setup. It's a short story, right? Just a little bit of setup so we know he's a jerk and we don't like him. So when he's shot, we aren't upset. But then as this bullet crosses his skull and moves through his brain, we get that kind of life in review series of flashes. And it's such a short story. We don't even get scenes. It's just moments, moment after moment. And he keeps being kind of a jerk and kind of unlikable until the very, very, very end, when these flashes go back in time all the way back to his childhood. And he's like on a baseball field. And he hears a kid with like a Southern accent or some accent different than his own say a couple of words. And he repeats these words to himself. He turns them over in his mind. And this is the moment he fell in love with words that launched. You know, if we started at that moment and went backwards into the present day, like, it's so beautiful. Because at the end, as a reader, like, oh, that's who he was. That's who he was before he became sour, before he became bitter, before he became the jerk I don't like. He was this little boy on a baseball field who fell in love with the feel of a word in his mouth. Mm-hmm. And that's what the story leaves you with.
Right. Right.
So where's the climax? Right? Is the climax when he gets shot, or is the climax when the reader goes, oh, okay, there's something. It just left me with something.
Right. And I think that's where, again, like you say, short fiction is a totally different animal, right? Because you would, in a longer, form, be like, that bullet, that was the climax. But we didn't have time to get to know him and to understand that that was who he was and who he had become. Mm-hmm. So that becomes the turning point. So it's almost like turning the story on its head, right?
Yes.
Rather than starting with the little boy and walking all the way through this life that ends in a bullet, it's flipped.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so brief. It's so condensed, and because it is a short story, and because we're meant to not like this guy, we don't need to get to know him. He can be just kind of a jerk, just kind of a caricature. And then there's this process of pulling back layers as we go through those, moments of memory, those little snippets, until we get to the point where, like you said, everything is turned on its head. Yes. And right, so,
turning point, like you said.
Yeah. And so then short stories can also be much more experimental than novels do, because you aren't dependent on a certain structure to convey something to the reader.
Also, I think while I was listening to you guys talk, metaphorically, if you think about it as a starter versus a main course, on a main course we may have many, many different elements that make up a main meal, but a starter or an appetizer or an hors d'oeuvre can be just one thing, like a jalapeno popper or something like that, which is still exquisite and may leave you wanting more, but there's no way you want a whole plate of it. So I think thinking about it as a bite size is the wrong sort of analogy for it. It perhaps applies to the size, but if you think about the idea about experimentation, you're much more likely to do a bit of experimentation with, maybe I'll take some tofu and I'll sugar it up and then I'll add some chili, or you sort of, it's not something you're going to do for a main course. And I think that's what the experimentation aspect of short stories can give. I'd also point listeners to, I think a couple of years ago, StoryGrid did an analysis of Brokeback Mountain, which is a short story, and it's a fabulous, it's a love story in I don't know how many words, 1,200 words or something. It's not many. 1,300 perhaps. And what I liked was that they broke it down beat by beat. So rather than trying to go act 1, act 2, act 3, because this is what Kathryn's saying is, that just seems like too clumsy a method for something that's so small. We can just drill down and be a bit more granular and look at how each beat moves the story forward. And that's fascinating if you start to do that. Like your analysis of the bullet to the brain is effectively a beat-by-beat analysis. It's like we've got this beat first where he's in the queue, this beat next where he's being unpleasant in the queue, this beat next where the robbers come in, this beat next where he laughs. And triggers something. This beat next where the bullet goes off, the gun goes off,
right.
and then the next few beats are where it all slows down. So I think we can learn a lot by taking what we believe are really good short stories and dissecting them to their beats, because that's so hard to do for a novel. If you try to you'd be more experienced at it, obviously, because that's what your job is, to
right.
edit and dissect. But for most of us, all we get is a sense. Whereas for a short story, you really can take them apart and see what are the mechanics, what made this work.
Right. And, something to keep in mind, too, is that a short story is so tightly woven and densely packed that there is no room for loose writing, for overdoing description, for an info dump. And you need to convey real characters, interesting, specific, special characters with something like a gesture. You aren't going to give us the wardrobe and the hairdo and the eye makeup and the this and the that and you're going to just nail that little bit of specificity that conveys to the reader who this person is.
Right. Or I know we talked about Black Bart a couple, in our previous episode, and it's on the reading series, but the crows in Black Bart, right? Boom. One little detail and it conveys a lot about the character.
Right. And that use of metaphor helps the story to be dense because, the crows caw, the protagonist thinks they're jeering at him, and the reader says, why, right? What's going on in his head? So right away there's this point of intrigue, and we don't need any more to be drawn into it. It's just that.
So lots of imagery, symbolism, metaphor. Everything means more than one thing, kind of a feeling.
Yes, but, it depends on the story too. Imagery, metaphor, meaning, yes. Subtext, yes, that's important. If you think of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, super, super famous short story, when you read it, what happens on the page is very straightforward. Every household gathers to draw lots. But then there's this talk going around about, who was it last year and how long has this been happening? And we do it on this day. That town over there does it on a different day. That town stopped. And the characters know all of the context, but the reader doesn't. The narrator does not fill us in and give us an aside. So that's where the intrigue is. We're oh, what is this ritual? How long has this been going on? Why are you guys doing this? Right? And then the tension builds as, the loser of the lottery is finally forced to come forward. And when you see the ending, it's so shocking, but you're pulled through the short story to that moment because there's more going on to this lottery than just a lottery.
Right. I think it's interesting, so I did an English major in college and they focus a lot on short stories. And I think when you read a lot of short stories, sometimes you can get this feeling of darkness, right? A lot of short stories really grapple with things that are really heavy that you can't grapple with in a longer form very well without really losing your reader. And I know we talked a little bit about this experimentation and stuff, but I will tell you, it is hard to read a lot of short stories in a row sometimes because you do get the opportunity to kind of touch on stuff with The Lottery that is very dark and very hard because you want the reader to sit with it, which is why I think it's interesting that you get short stories in collections like this and what are you supposed to do? Don't read them all at once. Not like a novel. Don't just crack it open to page 1 and start going. I was just looking at my shelf full of short story anthologies, but yeah. So it's grappling with that kind of harder stuff. Is that maybe easier to do in short story form? That sort of a thing.
Well, I think it's, easier depends on what you mean by easy. Craft-wise, no, because you do have to be concise and dense and, use a lot of subtext, but easier in the sense that you aren't living with that topic and you aren't forcing your reader to live with that topic for 300 pages. Yes, absolutely. And so you can contemplate some of those darker things in brief, which can be nice. But there are also a lot of short stories that are, about coming of age, or I'm trying to think of, are there any really happy short stories out there? I know there must be.
It's easy to think about the ones that really hit you on a deep emotional level, right? It's maybe not so easy to think about the ones that are a little more popcorn, right? Where you just read them and get that happy feeling and move on. But I'm sure there are, right? I'm sure there are.
Right. Well, yeah, I know there are, and it depends too on the period that you're in. Fitzgerald wrote his short stories for magazine publications. I forget which one, if it was the Sunday Times, but he had a regular publisher and that was his bread and butter. And he complained that his short stories weren't creative enough because he had to write, you need this many installments of, the weekly magazine, and you need this kind of formula to make that kind of reader happy. And so what he really loved doing were the novels. But then, when I was on the Waterstone Review editorial boards, you would see in a year that you would get stories on a theme. Like there would be all of these stories about cruelty to animals, like that's in the air in the past year or two. And so you're getting all of these stories. You remember the short story episode we did, and I brought Ed Buckley's short story. Yes, and listeners can go back. Kathryn will link to our short story episodes, and you can read Ed Buckley's.
Listener beware. No, I'm just kidding.
Fabulous short story. Yes, I was accused of bringing in the dark story. Are you ready to take your storycraft to the next level? Storyworks Fiction Online School has courses available right now, from micro courses on character traits to master level workshops on plot and building characters. There are also live workshops with your instructor in the classroom with you every week, guiding your progress and workshopping your manuscripts along the way. All students enrolled in Storyworks Fiction, whether active in a class or not, can take advantage of the monthly free live Q&A calls with Alida. Check out storyworksfiction.com today and take your storycraft to the next level.
But this is, on a more sort of, meta sort of feel. It's interesting, isn't it, that a lot of those early writers got their chops from churning out short stories one after the other, because as you say, it's how they got paid. And it was the same with science fiction. I mean, there's massive amount of science fiction short stories because they used to come in the magazines. But what's happened to those? In our modern world, do we have that? Does the short story form still get driven by commerce in the way that it was then? Because it was definitely formative, I'm sure, for many of those writers, because they had to get something in there that was going to be appealing, first of all, to the editor that was paying them. It was going to buy the story, and then hopefully, like Fitzgerald, maybe lead to some kind of recurring spot.
Well, we have literary journals all over the place, including the Storyworks reading series, folks. The newly launched. Yeah, there are lots of literary journals, many of them. So before the digitization and democratization of publishing, a literary journal was print and mostly affiliated with an MFA program, because being on the editorial board and producing the journal was also a learning experience for your students. So you still have literary journals all over the place that are print or print and digital that come out of MFA programs or even some Bachelor of Arts programs these days. But then there are a ton of indie literary journals now, too. You just have to look for them. I mean, if you want to publish short stories in literary journals, go to pw.org. That's Poets and Writers website. And they have resources for writers, and there are listings there. That's
the days of writing short stories and selling them to Reader's Digest or women's magazines or men's magazines or special interest magazines. I mean, newsagents are dying, so it's definitely the different media for it now. So there's got to be those outlets, I guess, somewhere.
Yeah, other than the New Yorker, not that I am a big magazine subscriber, but other than the New Yorker, I don't know of non-literary journal, any sort of serialized.
Some indie writers, indie publishers have done it via Patreon and given they're really loyal people who already have a following and have given their loyal following an opportunity to get a short story a month. I think even one writer was trying to do one a week, which is ambitious.
That is ambitious. That's terribly ambitious because the craft is tough. It takes a lot of effort. Yeah, I guess the thing with indie, one of my short stories a long time ago was published by an indie digital literary journal, and if you look at the website today, I think there were only 4 or 5 issues, and then it just stopped. So, but what about the craft of short stories? What else?
The short story thing is so funny to me because I'm reading a bunch of children's stuff right now because I have a toddler. And she gets those kids magazines, and as you guys were talking about this, I was thinking about they still have short stories and things in them that to be quite honest could use some good writers. Sometimes you read it and you go, really, like this? But I think that's where your happy is, right? Not just children's fiction or anything like that, but sometimes you want that story that's really going to make somebody want to read that magazine or read that whatever. But yeah, I've been even thinking about doing that, writing some short stories for my kid because she's really into telling stories right now, and she's got these magazines with stories in them. No judgment,
magazines not to be named.
Not to be named, will not name them, but it's okay, you can still write good craft short stories for kids. You don't have to just write random words. Sometimes it feels or no editorial. Anyway, but yeah. So editing wise, though, you're saying, the craft is still super. It's still super important. The craft is not just throw a bunch of words on the page and, oh, hey, look, I only hit 5,000. That must be a short story. And sometimes I feel the development on a short story is even heavier than my novel sometimes because I just need to really dig into the nitty gritty, especially we've been talking about single characters or point of view. Some of this stuff matters so much more in that short form, who's telling the story and from what perspective and how close or how distant, and the intrigue, you were saying, coming from what does the character know versus the reader know, and are they revealing it, and what's in the subtext versus not. So I think there's a lot more development that can go in at the beginning before you start writing, because it's easy to say, oh, I'll just bust out 8,000 words or whatever, in a couple of days or a week or 2 weeks, but I think that the initial development needs to be a lot heavier to get to that 8,000 words. More so than I feel I can kind of sort of discovery right my way through some of the scenes in a novel.
Yes,
I can come back and fix it, but if it's not right initially in the short story, then I'm just it's a little harder to get there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you remember the episode where we dissected Raymond Carver's Cathedral?
Yes.
Right. So nothing bad happens there. This guy's wife's old friend who happens to be blind comes to visit, and they watch a TV show about cathedrals, a documentary. So not every story has to be dark and heavy.
Right, yeah.
But
There's one.
yeah, but if you look at that episode where we dissected it, so much is happening on the level of subtext, on the emotional level, on the level of human relationships, and it does end somewhere. You know, you were saying, like, does the climax happen and then the story ends and there's no resolution? So let's take the word climax out. But you do get those kind of truncated endings where you get that hinge, that turning point, and then you leave the reader with that to carry that forward and just keep contemplating and digesting as you move on.
I think they're also a great place. I mean, development, quite clearly, it's, as Kathryn says, fundamental to making a short story work. I think they're a great place to also practice your revision and editing skills at a sentence level, at a paragraph level, because there's so much you can do. I spoke earlier on about beats, and a beat can be made more powerful simply by changing the order of clauses in a sentence, for example, or picking a really powerful or semantically packed word to end on. And that sets a certain tone. So, for example, a sentence that ends on, you know, with her is not necessarily as powerful as a sentence that might end with like a punch in the gut. So, you know, and yet both sentences might have tried to express the same idea. So I think it's a really, really great place to work on that as well.
Right.
To the degree where if you do enough of them, and I'm speaking from experience of having written thousands of book descriptions, you do get to a point where your writing outside of that becomes much more tight because you have to train yourself to do it. So I do think there's some experiential benefits from writing short.
Well, definitely.
Oh, huge.
And this is what I'm talking about, right? I have very limited time. And if I wanted to sit down and tackle, let's just even say a shorter novel, 60,000 words, it's still going to take me a ton of time to write it and then get back to the revision and then get back to a set, you know, and I'm going to lose track of stuff and things. It's just because of the amount of time I have to dedicate to it. So this is where that short form fiction is really appealing right now, is because I want to be refining my ability to look at revision and paragraphs and sentences. And it feels overwhelming to try to do that on a novel scale right now. And I don't think I'm alone in, you know, having time restrictions. You know, I'm not the only one in the world who looks at their novel and goes, when am I going to get back to that? Or, you know, I have 45 minutes every day. 45 minutes doesn't even feel like enough to get into my novel, but I can maybe focus on a paragraph in a short story. Right. So
yes, and short story writers, you know, I feel like we should remind people, because we're talking about the joys of short form and how quick it is, but it's not. Short story writers can spend weeks or months or years. And if you listen to Susan Walter talk about Black Bart, working on a single story because of what you're saying, that you have to craft it at that word by word level, you know, in order to make it that tight, that polished. But you can get a first draft in a couple of days or in a week or two, and then you can spend the time polishing and you can see it shape and reshape, and you can see that progress much more quickly than you can with the novel. And the other,
hold it in your hand a little better.
yes. And the other beauty of it is, you know, let's say you write a short story and then you want to set it aside, you write another short story, so you can play with different points of view, you can play with different settings, you can work on your narrative voice and see how do I sound as a writer if I'm in this time period or in this world, or if I'm adopting a distant view or a close view. And so you can, you know, in a novel you have to be consistent for the duration, but in short stories you get to play because you can do so many different things in a short time frame. Relatively short time frame.
It
Definitely.
Cool.
It reminds me of starting with something small. The funny story, when I was some kid and at high school and doing woodworking, I was useless with my hands, just I was an academic, not a physical person. So I went to woodworking class, and I think I joined the school in the second year. So everyone else had done some formative work in woodworking, and I'd never touched a piece of wood or a chisel or any sanding equipment. So they were just given a project. I pick a project. So I pick something. I better pick something simple. Okay, I'll carve a little lizard. That'll be easy. So I started out with this block of wood and carve it down, and then I realised I can't do feet. Okay, I can't do feet. All right, well I'll make it a snake then. So anyway, to cut a long story to a short story, it ended up as a stick with a face. So it's interesting, when you start carving things down, you start to see, well, what is the kernel of the real idea? So, what it obviously revealed to me is I didn't have the craft to do even something that apparently looks so simple. So, we can't be deceived that short stories, just because, as you say, Alida, you can produce a first draft quickly, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be anything other than just a stick with a face on it.
Yes, I love that analogy there. Getting down to the stick with the face on it. If you're listening to this podcast, you are probably a writer, and you've maybe heard me talk about the Storyworks reading series. It is the new branch in the Storyworks family tree. It is a literary journal podcast. That's right, a hybrid, a literary journal for your ears, with a print anthology at the end of the year of the best of the podcast. I am open for submissions, and I want to see your best prose right now. I am taking both fiction and creative non-fiction. You can read the guidelines and submit your work at storyworkspodcast.com/submit. What are you waiting for? It's time to see your stories published and sit on the other side of this microphone from me. Have a conversation about your storycraft. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.